topic. Most of my academic life, of course, has been spent studying the Protestantism of the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly Martin Luther and his impact on, or lack of impact in many ways, upon the English Reformation. So it's a pleasure to be among Lutherans. I was delighted to be excommunicated on Sunday when I attended the worship service here. Delighted because it reminded me that there are people out there who still believe what they're meant to believe. That's a good thing. And it was a great pleasure to hear two wonderful homilies and the morning worship services. So it is a delight to be here. For those of you who are geeks, it is only the communication of attributes that stops me being a Lutheran. I have a lot of great sympathy for the Lutheran Church. I want to speak today on the topic of Mephistophelean Man. The reason for the choice of that title will become obvious in a few minutes' time. But I want to suggest, and I think this came through in many ways in the remarkable unity of the three lectures we heard yesterday, I want to suggest that underlying many of our modern problems, the things that present themselves as matters of immediate concern, lies a much deeper problem. We're all familiar, for example, with the great difficulty that many seem to have today in answering the question, what is a woman? We are familiar with the questions that swirl around identity. Any of us here who work in higher education will no doubt be struck by the dramatic levels of anxiety and distress among young people today compared to when we were at college 20, 30, 40 years ago. I think underlying all of these issues is a deeper problem. And the deeper problem is this. The deeper problem is not that we have lost sight of what it means to be a woman. The deeper problem is that there is no longer really any practical consensus on what it means to be a human being. I think we live at a time of, to put it in slightly pretentious language, of deep anthropological crisis. Understanding what it means to be a human is something that is under severe challenge today. That came through, I thought, particularly loudly in Matthew's lecture yesterday when he delineated the various transformations that are taking place in things like medicine, where really at the root of those is the loss of a kind of normative notion of what it means to be a human being. I've said this on numerous occasions this year. It is the 80th anniversary of C.S. Lewis delivering the lectures that some years later became the amazing little book, The Abolition of Man. And what Lewis identified in 1943, in the midst of the Second World War in Europe, the problem of the abolition of man really continues to be our problem today. By the way, anybody sitting there thinking, this is great, Trueman's going to give us an answer to this. I'm just a historian. I only explain where the problems come from. I leave it to you to think about what the solutions might be. I want to set up the question a little bit differently, though, to the way it was done yesterday. I want to first of all, lay a sort of foundation for the discussion I want to engage in. I want to suggest that human beings, our condition is unique of all creatures on the face of the earth. And you don't even have to be a Christian, I think, to acknowledge the uniqueness of what it means to be a human being. And I want to put it this way, that the human condition is unique because we are the one creature on the face of the planet where there is a distinction, an important distinction, between what we are and who we are. To the point, in fact, that the who we are is often a lot more important than the what we are. What do I mean by that? I'm blessed to live in Western Pennsylvania. I grew up in the countryside. I struggled living in cities then for many decades. Finally, I'm back sort of where I began, in the countryside. And my wife and I, when we look out into our back garden, there is an abundance of wildlife there. And of all the creatures we see wandering through the garden on a relatively regular basis, and my favorite is the fox. The fox is a remarkably beautiful creature. What's interesting about the fox, of course, is that were a chicken to appear on the scene as the fox is wandering through my garden, I know exactly what would happen. A fox is an instinctive killing machine, maybe the most beautiful killing machine on the face of the earth. But I would suggest that if you've seen one fox in the presence of one chicken, you've seen every fox in the presence of every chicken. Such that if a chicken wandered across my garden while the fox was strolling across and the fox simply walked past and ignored it, I think the response would be, there's something wrong with the fox. Clearly that fox is not what it should normally be. It's the same with beavers. Beavers instinctively build dams. My wife and I, for many years, had a beloved Jack Russell Terrier. Jack Russell, just crazy. I love Jack Russell Terrier, but he's just insane. But he did not reflect on his insanity. He just was insane. For a fox, for a beaver, for a Jack Russell, there is really no significant difference between what they are and who they are. They're creatures of instinct. Now, if you have a Jack Russell, you get to know perhaps there may be little traits, personality traits that separate your Jack Russell from other people's. But by and large, there's a huge commonality. The what is far more important than the who. When you think of human beings, there's a big distinction. If I were to, during the coffee break, ask you about yourselves today, and you were merely to give me your blood group or your genome, you would be telling me what you are, but you would really be telling me nothing of any significance about you. The way we think about ourselves is not based upon the instinctive hard wiring we have as human beings. It's based upon the decisions, the choices we've made, the way we've reacted to the world around us. I put it this way, what we are is different or distinct from who we are. Think about this in terms of how we engage with each other. Think about Adam. There's that when Adam wakes up from the deep sleep and he sees Eve, this now is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Adam recognizes a whatness in Eve. There's a what there that coordinates with his whatness. But that will not be the most significant thing about their relationship. When you think about men and women, well, what is love? Love is when one human being looks at another human being and sees that human being as a person, as a subject, not as a thing. When I teach the humanities course at Grove, when I do the bit on creation, I always get the students to read the passage in Milton's Paradise Lost, where Adam wakes and he sees Eve. And Milton, don't go to Milton for your theology in general, I would say. But in terms of the description, when Adam sees Eve, and Milton essentially says, Adam becomes Adam at that point. Adam truly knows himself through gazing upon the face of another person. When you think of the most important thing in most of our lives, it's the people we love. Think about that. Love is sort of instinctive, but not totally instinctive. We don't just love other bodies. We love other persons. We look into the eyes of somebody else and we see them looking back at us as persons. And in love, we give ourselves freely. We give ourselves freely. And it's that freedom in giving, the fact that it isn't something we're hardwired to do with this particular person. It's that free giving of ourselves to the person that kind of makes us who we are. And you know this, think of it at a lower level. When go back to the dating days, when somebody asks you for a date, you don't want to look into their eyes and see them looking at you as an object. You want to look into their eyes and see them looking at you as a subject, as another person. You fall in love with somebody who will treat you as a person. And it's that freedom that makes love so wonderful. And of course, when you think about our identity is wrapped up with the people we love. It's something free, something unique to us, not something that is purely instinctive. I hesitate to say this after Katie's wonderful singing the virtues of parental love yesterday. But there is that phrase, a face only a mother could love. And it sort of captures something, doesn't it? Your mother has to love you. And it's great that mum always loves you. But your wife's love is much greater in some ways because she doesn't have to love you. She has chosen to love you. And that's what makes marital love so much more distinctive in some ways. So all of this is to say the who, the free things about us are the most important in how we think about ourselves. That brings me then to explain the description or the title of this lecture as the Mephistophelean Man. I presume Katie's husband's most famous ancestor, Dr. Faust, the late medieval alchemist, subject of numerous great literary works, perhaps the greatest of which is that produced by Goethe in the early 19th century, in many ways his life's work. Goethe's Faust is fascinating for the speeches that are made. It's not really, in some ways, a play to be acted. It's a poem to be read. And in one of the first encounters between Dr. Faust and the demonic Mephistopheles figure, Mephistopheles makes this speech. This occurs in Goethe's Faust, Part 1. My dear sir, you are looking at things in a conventional way. We must do better than that, or the joys of life will escape us. Hang it. You have your hands and feet. You have a headpiece and a codpiece. And anything else you can enjoy is yours, isn't it? And then we have the really significant punchline. If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy mine? I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs. Listen to that again. If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy mine? I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs. I think what Mephistopheles, or what Goethe through Mephistopheles is presenting to Faust there, is one of the great temptations of the modern age. Let technology define who you are. If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy mine? I can ride around proudly as if I had 24 legs. And what I want to suggest this morning, sort of to parlay this back into what I've said so far, is this. Technology, as we now have it, intensifies the temptation to allow the who question to overwhelm the what question. It's interesting that when Adam sees Eve, we have in some ways a wonderful balance of the what and the who. The what means that Eve is the only one that he can fall in love with. That's bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And yet they will go on to have this wonderful union and to have children. There'll be a who-ness that emerges from it, but it's grounded in the whatness. I want to suggest, and I think Matthew was really did a fantastic job of doing in more detail what I'm just going to skim the surface of today, is this. The technology is really allowing us or tricking us into imagining that we can ignore the whatness, ignore the normative notion of human nature for how we think and behave. It is turning even our bodies into raw material that really have nothing to do with who we might actually be. I should preface this by saying, don't interpret me as in this lecture as sort of hating technology. I do, by and large, hate technology, but I'm trying to keep that to one side. I'm mindful of I think it was Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, has this wonderful lecture, The Question About Technology, the questions concerning technology, where he sort of chops up how technology can be used. And he says, there's a big difference between building a bridge over a river and damming up a river to generate hydroelectric power. Building a bridge over a river kind of respects nature in a way. Damming up the river turns nature into raw material that can be used to produce something completely different. Think about it a little bit like difference between riding a bicycle and driving a Tesla car. I kind of like Elon Musk because he seems to annoy all the right people, but he's killing the stick shift, which is a tragedy for me. I'm a stick shift sports car guy. But think about the difference between a Tesla and a bicycle. When I love riding my bike around the hills of Western Pennsylvania. My ability to go up the hills is much faster when I'm on my bike than if I'm walking, but I'm still aware it's a hill. I'm still aware it's a hill. If I'm in my car and if I'm in one of those dreadful automatic things or Tesla, I'm not even aware it's a hill. Just point in the right direction and the machine does everything for me. So this is just to sort of say in the background, there are ways of using technology that I think are good, and there are other ways that sort of obliterate nature. Think about it in those terms. And I'd want to say as we use technology, let's think about doing it in the former rather than the latter. But anyway, back to my original thesis here. I think what technology is doing is it's detaching the who question from the what question. Why do I set it up like this? One of the concerns I have often today as a Christian interacting with what's going on in the public square is this. There can be a great temptation for Christians not to spot their own complicity in what's going on. Perhaps I shouldn't have to say that to Lutherans. You have that, the one time, simul justus et peccator, at the same time, righteous and a sinner. Lutherans acutely aware, I hope, of complicity in the fallenness of the world. But there can be a temptation, because we're not involved in pride stuff. And we criticize pride stuff to fail to realize that we actually buy in to some of what I would call the cultural pathologies that have made Pride Month possible. And that can foster in us very much an attitude of, I thank you, Lord, that I'm not like other men. So what I want to do now is to reflect upon ways in which technology, perhaps as we've unconsciously had our imaginations remade in a way that may not make us pro-LGBTQ, for example, but makes us part of the world where that kind of stuff is plausible, particularly plausible to the rising generation. Again, I love Matthew's lecture yesterday. The references he made to the lack of Christian reflection on IVF and things like that points us to one obvious way where Christian imaginations have been shaped by the world around, perhaps in inappropriate ways where we've not even realized that's happening. So what I want to do today is look at some of the elements of our world that shape the intuitions of us all and have made this kind of self-creation, this supremacy of the who over the almost non-existent what possible. And the first, I gave a version of this lecture actually as a Christian college earlier this year, and it was the first time ever I'd been protested. It was a very polite protest, but I got a tip off. I called them our college on the Monday and I said, there's not going to be a protest, is there? And the guy said, no. Our students don't protest things. He picked me up at the airport on the Wednesday and he said, I need to bring you up to speed on something. So, okay. And so I actually rearranged the lecture. I think it's better this way. I'm going to rearrange the letter to really throw the protesters off guard. So I sort of said, okay, I know that a third of you here or whatever are here to protest me. So let's get the really controversial stuff out of the way first. So I said, the first topic I want to look at is music. Let's think about music. And at that point, the protesters, I don't think knew what to do, and they sat quietly, and it was a very constructive time I actually had with them in the end. But think about music. Why do I highlight music? Well, music's a big part of most of our lives. I'm guessing almost everybody here, if not everybody here, enjoys music. What I want to do now is just offer some reflections on how music shapes the way we think about ourselves. Because I think there has been a fundamental inversion of the purpose of music over the last 150 years that has a profound effect. When you think about music, historically, why does music exist? Well, one of the reasons it exists is for community. It has a communal significance. Key events in communal life, I won't say in every culture in the world because I'm not familiar with every culture, but every culture with which I have some familiarity has a role for communal music, typically to mark significant life events, births, deaths, weddings, celebrations, lamentations, communal experiences marked by music. African American spiritual tradition, out of which the blues emerged. Well, what's our African American spirituals? They emerge out of that communal experience of suffering and exile. Think of the Psalms. We've already touched on Psalms this morning in the worship service. I've never sung 10 verses of a hymn, by the way, but that was a fantastic hymn. I could have gone on for another 10. That was great. Paul Gerhardt, we have a few of his hymns in the Presbyterian hymn book. Don't think we have that one, but what a great hymn that was. Hymns. We gather for worship and we express our response to God's grace communally through music. Psalms of the Old Testament, communal expressions of Israel's experience, individually written. David wandering in the wilderness, but those wilderness wanderings for David become the experience of the community in exile as they sing them. The rich tradition of ballads and folk songs that many cultures have. Music arose out of, reflected, and I think constituted a big part of communal life for many people. To be involved in music was to be necessarily part of a bigger whole. Why? Because up until about 120, 130 years ago, 140 years ago, to enjoy music, it had to be live. You had to be at the concert. You had to be at the church. You had to be at the funeral. You had to be at the wedding. Music as a phenomenon is a communal thing, and it reflects communal life, and it shapes our intuitions to thinking about life as community. What about music today? I listen to a lot of music, but I by and large listen to it as an individual. Not only do I listen to it as an individual, I typically listen to it to cut myself off from other people. I actually read books. I got on a plane recently and I took a book out, and the woman sitting next to me was just coming back from a Taylor Swift concert. She didn't believe that I'd never heard of I'd heard of Taylor Swift, couldn't name a song by her. But I took my book out and she said, "Wow, a paper book." And I'll always remember her next line was, "You're really old school." And I thought, I was preaching the following day, I thought, this woman is tomorrow's sermon illustration and she doesn't even know it. It was, but anyway, I'm always kind of relieved when I sit down on a plane and the person next to me puts the earbuds in. Why? Because I'm an introverted, antisocial Englishman and I don't want to talk to somebody I don't know. And it's glad they're cutting themselves off from me. But joking aside, think about that. Think about how music permeates our society now, but it has become by and large a matter of individual taste. It has moved from being a matter of communal production to individual consumption. That, I'm not sure I'm capable of tracing out all the significance of that, but it has to be hugely significant for how we think about things when something that's the very existence was to make us a community has actually become something to make us individuals. And with the advent of Spotify, prog rock is dead. You don't need, there's no such thing as a concept album anymore because you can pick and choose exactly what you want when you want to listen to it. It's odd, isn't it, though? I think most of us would acknowledge that live music is better. One of the lovely things about teaching at a liberal arts college is that Grove has a wonderful traveling choir, and an embarrassment of riches among young musicians, from jazz through to classical. And my wife and I, we live in the middle of nowhere in Western Pennsylvania, and we hear more live classical music now than we've ever done in our lives. And it's wonderful because there's something about being with other people when music is produced. Even, I think, in an odd way, young people today have some sort of folk memory of that. Students in my class, I'll ask, are you dating somebody? Yes. Is it a long-distance relationship? Yes. I say, do you ever do this weird thing where you watch the same movie on Amazon simultaneously? And they say, yeah. And it doesn't seem weird to them. And I'll say, why isn't it weird to you? Because I want to experience the same thing at the same time as my loved one. It points us towards music and cultural productions as really being those that should bind us together. Now that they have by and large become matters of individual consumption, it is not surprising that the notion of the sovereign, self-creating, consuming individual grips our imagination. You could do the same thing with dance. I won't do it here, but think about dancing. Actually, I will do it here. Think about dancing. I show slides that grow when I teach this, and the one slide comes from the BBC production of Pride and Prejudice, maybe 25 years ago, and it's a communal dance scene. The other slide comes from Saturday Night Fever. It's John Travolta strutting his stuff, which to me is a recent movie. To my students is like, the amount of people around who were still there when it came out. I feel if it's not black and white or star Gene Kelly, it's not a classic movie as far as I'm concerned. But I asked the students, think of the difference between these two pictures. Dancing in the Jane Austen scene, if you were to sort of eliminate by the use of technology, you were to scrub all of the dancers except Mr. Darcy, and you just looked at his dance moves, he would look utterly ridiculous because he only makes sense when he coordinates his dance steps with those of everybody else. Dancing is a corporate, communal thing that is a constitutive part of being a communal being. One could, in some ways, riff again on what Matthew was saying yesterday when he talked about dependency. How is human dependency reflected culturally there? Well, there's a dependency of the baby on the mother, of course, but there's a dependency of one dancer on another in a communal dance. It's part and parcel of a way of understanding what it means to be human, where other people are critical for my identity and critical for me to make sense. Then you move through the history of dance, we move into the waltz and the foxtrot, and that's kind of intermediate state. There you have the one guy dancing with the one girl. So it's not quite communal, but it's still relational. Finally, you get to John Travolta. What's John Travolta doing? He's strutting his own stuff. Dance has become an adversarial competition at that point, where one individual tries to outdance the other. I joke to the students these days, mating today, dancing today, it's a mating ritual. John Travolta is displaying his wares, trying to attract a female. I use that excuse when my wife and I go to weddings. We've got to go to one this Saturday. She will want me to dance. I'm sure I hate dancing. And my excuse is always, it's a mating ritual. I found my mate. I don't need to dance anymore. But anyway, think about music and dancing. Think about how that shapes about how we think about what it means to be a human being. You might say, these are trivial things. I'd say to you, no, they're not. Music is a very, very important part of human culture. Dancing has been a very, very important part of human culture. When those things change their function, something very, very significant is going on in the way people imagine themselves to be in the world and in relation to others. Next section, and here I can be very brief because this was where Matthew really zeroed in yesterday. The medical field. I use slightly different terminology, but I say, with medicine, we've moved from a position where medicine was primarily restorative to one where it's become transformative. Plastic surgery has been around time immemorial. We have presumably fairly horrific examples of rhinoplasty from the ancient world. But plastic surgery really takes off, as I understand the modern history, after the First World War in Britain. where you have a lot of young men coming back from the trenches whose bodies have been burned by mustard gas and whose bodies have been mutilated by whiz-bangs and bombs and bullets. And plastic surgery develops as a way of trying to restore a bit of basic human dignity to men who've lost the flesh off their face. It assumes a normative understanding of what it means to be a human being. It assumes some sort of vision, not a perfect vision, but a normative one. Not a vision that demands everybody conform. As Matthew's pointed yesterday, if somebody's born with one leg, it doesn't mean they're not a human being. But we would all acknowledge that something isn't there that should be there, ideally. Your typical human being should have two legs, not one and not three. Well, think about how plastic surgery, though, has moved from being restorative to being truly cosmetic now. What plastic surgery often does is attempt to realize a vision that transcends the normative on the basis of unreasonable expectations of perfection and allows the human will to lord it over the human body. We could think about gene editing was mentioned yesterday. Again, gene editing, I have a friend whose granddaughter has a terrible and random genetic condition. And we were talking about gene editing. He's actually a pastor. And he said to me, if there was a button I could press that would just change my granddaughter's gene and give her a normal life and normal life expectancy, I would do it. And I don't think I have any moral objection to that at all. Because he's really pointing to if it would make my granddaughter normal, if it would give her a normal human experience based upon a normative understanding of human nature. When we get into the game of editing genes to produce spectacularly high IQs, et cetera, the line where one ends and the other begins may well be blurred, as was pointed out yesterday, but we're starting to move into areas that are not dealing with a normative notion of human nature, but with what kind of human nature can we construct by our own power and our own will? Think of surgery geared to psychological therapy. We'll talk about this in a few moments' time again, but I would put transgender surgery in that category. Surgery geared to psychological therapy, where the realities of nature, we might say, of a normative nature, are subjugated to the ambitions of desire. Think about that. Think about how medical technology, the possibilities, shape how we imagine what it means to be a human being. I would suggest one of the reasons why people have so much difficulty today defining what it means to be a woman is that we've been told the specious picture, I think it is, of the idea that, well, technology can actually overcome bodily sex. We can imagine that now in a way that it could not have been imagined by anybody 100, 120 years ago. You go to a doctor's surgery 120 years ago and say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. The doctor's going to say that's a problem. It's a problem of the mind. We need the mind to be brought into conformity with the body. Today, it's going to be the other way. It's a problem with the body. We need to bring the body into conformity with the mind. One of the reasons for that difference is the doctor today can imagine the second answer as plausible because of the way technology has transformed our understanding of the authority of the human body. We could move into the realm of sex now. Much could be said about how technology has transformed sex. And I would argue, this would take longer to argue in detail, but I would argue that sex and sexual desire are some of the absolute hardy perennials of human existence. There are many things that tear up our the political sphere today that I think are arguably significant social constructs. The role of race, for example. But erotic desire, it doesn't matter how far you go back in world literature, it's there. It's there. There's a reason why we can read the Iliad today and understand what's going on. I can put it rather facetiously and say, it's an American lunchtime soap opera with gods and heroes. What do I mean by that? It's a tale of adultery. One guy falls in love with another guy's wife, runs off with her. The jilted guy is angry, gangs up with his brother, and goes over to fetch her back. That's the basic dynamic of the story. It's a magnificent piece of literature. But nobody reads the Iliad today and says, I haven't got a clue what's going on. Why do these guys behave this way? We know why they behave that way, because we in our own small world behave in exactly the same way for exactly the same reasons. So I would say with sex, as with music, when something that's a hardy perennial of human existence significantly changes its meaning, a significant change in what it means to be human is taking place. Sex as recreation, which is essentially how it is thought of today, is only possible in a technological world. It has to be safe. Last year, my wife and I were wandering through a town in central Pennsylvania. We found ourselves in the middle of a pro-abortion rally. And one of the signs being waved around was consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. That sign would have made no sense 150 years ago. Consent to sex would at least have been consent to the possibility of pregnancy for at least one of the people involved that time. That's a technologically enabled sign. It makes sense. It makes sense to us because the way we imagine what it means to be a human being has been changed by the technological possibilities of the world around us. Think of how sex as recreation has transformed the nature of male-female relationships. It's, I think, bad news for women, by and large. To use the phrase of Mark Regnerus, sex has become very cheap for men, by and large. 100 years ago, you're a young guy, you want to sleep with a girl, what do you got to do? You got to be clean, you got to have a job, you got to have prospects, you got to persuade her parents and possibly her brothers that you're a decent bet. Because if you sleep with her and she gets pregnant, there are going to be very, very serious consequences for you and for her as a result. So you have to work hard to earn the right to sleep with that girl within the bounds of marriage. Once sex becomes technologically easy and safe, you don't have to work as hard. You don't have to work as hard. And it's interesting, in the last year, 3 books published by women who do not at this point profess to be Christians, Christine Ember, Mary Harrington, and Louise Penny, have all argued that the sexual revolution is bad news for women. And that's one of the points they make. It was meant to liberate women, but guess what it did? It turned women into objects. They ceased to be persons, worthy of respect, worthy of working for, and they became objects to be used and thrown away. Think of pornography. Pornography, the scourge of pornography is technologically enabled. It objectifies the other. Pornography, above all things, teaches us that the other is a means rather than an end. In fact, both of the people, all of the people involved in the sexual activity on screen are merely means to the satisfaction of the person watching, who has to make zero sacrifice on their behalf whatsoever. Sex, which was meant to be about the giving of the self, becomes a matter of the objectification of the other. And again, I think intuitively we know that sex is significant, and the significance we give to it is not merely a social construct. Paul, of course, makes it clear that sexual immorality, man sleeping with a prostitute, is particularly heinous. But even non-Christians understand this. My friend Frank Beckwith, professor of law at Baylor University, is Roman Catholic, a legal scholar, but very well trained in philosophy, written a great paper where he looks at the Harvey Weinstein issue as a way of getting to the fact that sex is more than just recreation. So, if we heard that Harvey Weinstein was insisting that young female starlets cook him dinner so that his wife wasn't so tired at night and he was able to sleep with her, we'd regard him as a creep, but we wouldn't regard him as a monster. And yet the dynamic is very similar. He's forcing a young girl to do something she doesn't want to do so he can get sexual satisfaction. To which Frank then raises the objection, yes, but maybe it's the penetration of the body that's the problem. Frank says, okay, think of a second scenario. Harvey Weinstein is insisting that these girls that he is recruiting for his movies allow him to lick his finger and stick it in her ear in order to get a place in the movies. Again, if we heard that, what would we think? We'd think Harvey Weinstein is a creep, but we probably wouldn't think he's a monster. And Frank asked the obvious question. So why do we think he's a monster? Why is that form of bodily penetration so much more heinous than that form? And his point is this: sex has a unique status among human beings. It's the act, of course, when we're closest to God. It's a creative act. I would also suggest that sexual assault is heinous. We know this because it involves the forcible taking of something that only you can give. Sex cannot be taken. It can only be given in a properly ordered relationship. It can only be given because only when it is given is the other treated as an end in themselves and not as a means to an end. When sex is taken, then you've taken something from that person that is only theirs to give. And I would go on and say, yeah, what is it that's been taken? I'd say, their very self. Their very self. Any of you who have spent time either on an elder board, a session, or in the pastorate will know that, somebody gets punched in the face, they're going to get over it. But the people you pastor who are sexually assaulted, they never quite get over that. Why not? Because something was forcibly taken from them that was only theirs to give. Their very self. And that raises the question then, when we try to con ourselves that it's just recreation, or pornography is a victimless crime as long as everybody on the screen is agreeing to what's going on, how on earth you verify that, I have no idea. But if sex is just recreation, why all of the pain? It's a perversion of what it means to be human. The pornified culture in which we live sends signals to us that dehumanize us, destroy what it means to be human. And then we come to transhumanism. Again, that was dealt with yesterday, but I want to suggest here just a sort of a supplement to what was said yesterday, and that is this. And this is the thing I miss in my two books on the self. I dealt with transgenderism very much as a sort of political phenomenon, as part of the LGBTQ movement, and certainly is. It also rests upon similar premises of the sovereignty of the individual desire as determinative of identity. But there are some obvious differences between transgenderism and the L, the G, and the B. One, transgenderism is not necessarily a matter of sexual desire. We have these strange situations where a guy thinks he's a woman, but is still in love with his wife. So sexual desire and gender dysphoria, not the same thing. They may go together, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Second thing is this. I think transgenderism is actually a subset of transhumanism. It's transhumanism that's the real issue. I completely missed that. It's transhumanism. It's part of the transcendence of biological limitations and the elimination of the significance of biological relations that is going on within our culture at the moment. Again, riffing a bit off what Katie said yesterday. Isn't there a cultural shift in our world towards parenting as function? Didn't I just use an interesting phrase there when I said parenting? I don't know when parenting became a verb, but when I was growing up, parent was a noun. Now, to parent is a verb. That's interesting. You just were a parent when I was growing up. Now it's becoming something you do functionally. And laws, I think in the next 10 years, what will be interesting to see is laws in this country shifting towards the functional definition of parenting. And as we shift towards a functional definition of parent, we move towards a very ideological view of what it means to be a parent. Already seeing this in California with the proposed bill that would make affirmation of a child's gender confusion part of what it means to be a good parent. Transgenderism, then, I think, is part of transhumanism. And this, again, connects to technology. Would we not expect in our world the body to be less significant the more and more we interact in disembodied ways? Quotation here from Mary Harrington's great book, Feminism Against Progress. She's one of the women I mentioned earlier, as far as I know, not yet a Christian, but her writings are works that I think Christians should read because she has great insights into what's going on in the culture. She says this: when we socialize in disembodied ways online, even as biotech promises total mastery of the bodies we're trying to leave behind, these efforts to abolish sex dimorphism in the name of the human will end up abolishing what makes us human, men and women, leaving something profoundly post-human in its place. In this vision, our bodies cease to be interdependent, sexed, and sentient, and are instead reassembled as a kind of meat Lego. Wish I'd invented that phrase, meat Lego, built of parts that could be reassembled at will. Reminds me of a picture I was sent recently of a box of pork chopped up into cubes, and somebody had put the label on it, a Peppa Pig three-dimensional jigsaw. Rather distasteful, but amusing nonetheless. But what she's saying there, she's sort of saying there what I've been trying to say about other things, that the more we interact in disembodied ways, the more we will start to think of our embodiment as irrelevant or even as a hindrance. Shaping this idea of the sovereign, self-creating will. So all of these things, music, medicine, attitudes to sex, transhumanism, all of these things are enabled by technology and send that constant message to us that we are sovereign, disembodied wills that detach who we are from what we are. The what we are becomes a function of the who we are in this technologized world, if you like. How are we to respond? It's always great when you hear a series of lectures one day and they come to similar conclusions to yourself. I was saying to Aaron Cariati early on, it's good to be reassured that you're not completely away with the fairies when you hear other people saying similar things. The solution, I think, has to involve a reassertion of the importance of the body. And the good news is, I think some human tuitions still point that way. A couple of examples. COVID was a great gift to us on this front. I don't have a single student in my classes who actually liked lockdown. What became very evident to university and college administrators during COVID was the colleges think the students are paying for tuition. The students think they're paying to hang around with their pals on campus. That's what they pay their tuition for. They want to be there in bodies, most of them. They want to interact in a bodily form. So I think we have that we can build off in recent history. We intuitively know that bodies are important. One of the scenarios I try to paint for students when I teach on life stuff at Grove is this. Say, imagine a scenario where in Princeton, late at night, you have two Princeton professors, Robbie George, one of the great pro-life thinkers and advocates of our generation, and Peter Singer, one of the great pro-abortion, pro-euthanasia thinkers of his generation, walking down Nassau Street together at midnight, and they hear a baby crying, and they look over to a shop door, and they see a small basket with a tiny baby in it. I don't think there's going to be any disagreement between Peter Singer and Robbie George on what to do there and then with that baby. Peter Singer is not going to say, well, it's obviously a newborn, so it isn't a person for at least another 23 months. I think we can leave it for the feral animals to eat. He's not going to do that because that little body is clearly a dependent person to him at that point. He and Robert George, one of them's going to stay and look after the baby. The other one's going to call for an ambulance. No doubt in my mind. In fact, there's an amazing interview with Peter Singer on, you can find it online, where the interviewer puts it to him that it was a bit inconsistent when his mother had Alzheimer's or some equivalent of Alzheimer's disease. He and I think his sister helped care for her. And the interviewer says, but you think when somebody's lost their mind in that way, they cease to be a person. Isn't it a bit inconsistent? And Singer gives this kind of poker-tell answer, reveals everything. He says, yes, I guess it is. But it's different when it's your own mother. Well, of course. She gave birth to you. She fed you at her breast. She probably put sticking plaster on your knee when you fell over in the school playground and came home crying. But your mother is not an abstraction. Humanity is an abstraction. Bodies are abstractions on one level. But as I said right at the very start, we don't fall in love with bodies in general. We fall in love with that person. Persons are not abstractions. Persons are not abstractions. We need to recapture the imagination for the notion of personhood. And that's where I think we as a church, we as churches need to focus our attention on the local and on hospitality. It's very striking to me that in Paul's qualifications for eldership, hospitality is included. My view of the eldership qualifications is this: the elder is meant to embody everything that every Christian should aspire to be. The elder is meant to be that guy in the church you can point your kids to and say, when you grow up, you want to be like him. With the exception perhaps of teaching. The elder is meant to be able to teach, and not everybody has the gift of teaching. That's not a moral failing. But nobody should be getting regularly drunk or causing a disturbance in their neighborhood or being short-tempered, etc. Those are all things that no Christian should do. And hospitality is there at the heart. Why hospitality? Because hospitality is personal. My wife and I, we moved to Grove City. We moved from Philly, expensive city, to Western Pennsylvania. You can buy half the state for the price of a house. In Philadelphia, we bought a bigger house than we need. Why? Because we like to throw it open for students. Much to my wife's frustration, we'll throw a house open for 3 nights, maybe in 2 weeks. And I'll just say to all the students I teach, hey, come along for one of them. So we get 20 students one night and 70 the next, something like that. We love giving hospitality. We don't remember the names of all the students who turn up for hospitality at our house. We don't restrict it to students we like. It's just anybody I teach, plus their girlfriend or boyfriend if they want to bring them along. But you always remember the names of the people who gave you hospitality. I had a taste of this last year when I gave a lecture in London, and the man who invited me to lecture said, I noticed we were on the faculty together at the University of Nottingham in 1993, 1994. He said, don't think we ever met. And I emailed him back and said, oh, we did meet. Because when I came down to teach, I came down for 8 weeks, half a semester, while my wife was teaching out her contract in Scotland. And the first weekend I was in Nottingham, all by myself, I attended his church, and he and his wife turned around in the pew and invited me back to lunch. All on my own in a strange city, new job, people I didn't know opened their home to me on a Sunday, invited me into the bosom of their family. I didn't forget his name. He probably did that for hundreds of people over the years. He's a hospitable guy. He doesn't remember everybody, but you remember the names of the people that give you hospitality. So my end is going to be, there are arguments against a lot of the stuff that I've laid out here. But what can we do? What can we do tomorrow that will make a difference? I think hospitality. Hospitality in a world where sovereign individual wills are being exalted and where traditional communities are just crumbling and collapsing, leaving particularly young people desperate for something solid, desperate for somebody to look into their eyes and for them to see themselves being seen of as a person, not as an object or a problem. I think hospitality is the way to go. So, sorry if that's a disappointingly simple conclusion, but I actually think this kind of stuff is best solved when we look into the eyes of other people in the context of hospitality. Thank you for listening so patiently.
On the drive down, I indulged in listening to your podcast, which I commend to everyone here, The Mortification of Spin. It's delightful. And you had interviewed an author of, I think, a book that we have out on display about the toxic attack against masculinity.
Nancy Pearcey, yeah.
Nancy Pearcey, thank you. And you made reference today about this question, what is a woman? I wonder if you'd reflect for us on, I'm struck how people are not asking what is a man. What's under attack is the expression of manhood that we call masculinity. And yet the very existence of a woman is in question. We're not asking, we're not talking about toxic femininity. Why do you think there's sort of a disproportion there?
Yeah, an interesting question. I doubt there's a simple answer to that. A couple of comments, though. I think what gender theory does that is correct is it does grab hold of the fact that the way what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman varies from culture to culture in significant ways. If you exclude biology, so masculinity in the United States of America is very different to the ideal of masculinity that I was brought up with in the UK. In the UK, coming from UK is very class-oriented, so forgive me if it becomes incomprehensible at this point, but for guys of my class, masculinity involved not showing emotion, being reserved. I don't think my dad ever actually said to me he loved me. That's not, in America, that would be a plea for help. For me, he didn't have to. I'd have cringed if he had to. I knew he loved me because of the way he behaved towards me. He loved me more than anything. And what gender theory, I think, has done is grabbed hold of this and says, there's a lot of social construction in how we understand masculinity and what it means to be a woman. And some of the things that are socially constructed have not been good. You watch the old John Wayne movie, The Quiet Man, these days, and at some point, he slaps Maureen O'Hara to stop her from sort of screaming. It makes you, think, oh gosh, no, that shouldn't be done. And I think what we're experiencing today is a reaction against that kind of stuff. I don't think we can win the war against that by setting up one set of social constructions against another. Reserved is better than John Wayne, this kind of thing. I think that what we have to do is get beyond talking about gender performances in those senses and go back to basic biology. You may have heard the other podcast I did where my co-host, Todd Pruitt, every now and then he's called away on pastoral issues. And I always think, is it because this is a podcast that is going to be controversial? He's dropped me right in it. I interviewed Abby Favale, wonderful gender theorist from Notre Dame. And I recommend her book, The Genesis of Gender. It's, I think, the best Christian guide to what's going on. And I started that interview by saying, okay, Abby, I'm going to ask you a question that has apparently stumped some of the greatest minds of our generation. What is a woman? She gives me like a 45 to a 1 minute answer, straight like that. She says, a woman is a human being whose body is tailored towards the telos, the end of gestation of new life. And that makes the answer to what is a man easy as well. A man is a person whose body is tailored towards the fertilization of the woman's body that is then tailored towards gestation. And then we start to think about, well, what does it mean to be a man or a woman? We start to think of it in terms of the responsibilities that that process creates. Now, that isn't to say that if you're a single man or you're an infertile man or woman, you're not really a man or a woman. We're going back to that normative notion of what it means to be a human being. But I think if we're going to address the issue of what it means to be a man, we need to go to the issues of what does a man look like when he has responsibility for child rearing? Or in a broader sense, responsibility for being an example to the rising generation, even if they're not his own kids. I think that's what we need to think about. My worry is that so much, particularly in the evangelical world, looking at American evangelicalism as an outsider and as an immigrant, so much of American evangelical notions of masculinity do seem rather American to me. Now, that's not to go down the Jesus and John Wayne route. I think that's a massively overstated thesis. But I don't think it was entirely wrong, if I could put it that way. I might be getting into trouble in some quarters because everybody these days is meant to be entirely right or entirely wrong. But I would say, coming as an outsider to America, there are things about the American construction of manhood that I don't recognize and I don't see in myself. And I don't think it's because I'm effeminate. I think it's because I'm English. Some of you may connect the two. I don't know, but you know, and so I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a general crisis out there about masculinity, femininity. What is a woman? I think within the church, what we need to do is place child rearing back at the center. Not everybody can have a child. I understand. I would commend also my friend Erica Bakioki's book, The Rights of Women, where what she does there is she says we need a new legal theory of rights. Rights are things that we have to allow us to fulfill our obligations. Our obligations are prior to our rights. And she uses that with men and women and says, yeah, we need rights in this country that mean that men and women fulfill their responsibility to the children they have. That's how we do it. And again, I think Katie was very much sort of pushing in that direction yesterday.
Thank you for your views on music, and I've made my living in the music business. That's what I've done. I'm a songwriter, and it's an amazing thing how music does influence our lives in so many ways. AI. I'm a songwriter, so my best songs come in a matter of just a few minutes. I don't know where that comes from. 3 chords and the truth. That's Hank Williams. That's it. And then sometimes I can work on a song for 3 years before I go, okay, that's finished. But it comes out of this emotion and human experience that we have. I thought AI is not going to be able to get into this creative mode, but I've seen now AI definitely will be writing our songs. And it can write a song. If I give it a topic or a storyline at all, enter it in, within a matter of 30 seconds, it'll have a song in the style that I want. And if I don't like that style, I can say, I don't like it bluegrass, give it to me in rap. Another 30 seconds, out it comes.
Yeah.
And they're very well written. They're written, I look at the storyline, I go, wow, that's AI. So with music influencing our culture, we need to be aware that the music that's going to be coming is not going to be coming from us as musicians or poets or songwriters from an artistic, creative end. It's going to be coming from someone who knows how to run a computer and influence us very greatly. So I thank you for bringing that up.
And I feel in some ways what you described is I won't say the ultimate, but certainly the next stage of music as an item of consumption. It's not even being created in the conventional way at that point. Now, there was a performance at Grove, I think in the last few months, Beethoven's 10th Symphony. Some years ago, this was long before the latest thing, somebody used AI to construct from the fragments of Beethoven's 10th Symphony what the whole thing would look like. And musicians I know who listened to it said, it was good, but it didn't sound like Beethoven. Whether that's them not wanting it to sound like Beethoven, I don't know. But I hope that human self-consciousness and experience is still important for these cultural things. I can imagine producing a Lady Gaga song by computer. I'm amazed if they're not already written by computer. But I wonder if the greatest songs could ever be produced by computer. That will be interesting to see.
Hi, I wanted to thank you for your presentation as well. In online circles that I've been a part of, especially ones that are predicated on anonymity, you choose a screen name and an avatar, and even just like Twitter, right? People who are struggling with gender dysphoria tend to kind of almost soft launch their new identity in those circles, where you're not face to face. They're not out of the closet, as it were, in public, but online, everybody knows them by their preferred gender. So we talked a lot about disembodiment. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how anonymity and the way that technology enables anonymity has also played into this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in a large number of ways, not just in terms of gender dysphoria. I think the modern collapse of friendship connects to it. Again, one of the things is striking to me about higher education is how much anxiety there is among young people today. I think at Grove, 40% of the students will see a counselor either for themselves or on behalf of somebody else during their time, and Grove is not untypical of colleges across the United States. Why are young people so anxious? I mean, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. We were doing nuclear bomb drills. There were all kinds of crazy things going on that should have made us more anxious. But I just, okay, we shelter under our desk for 30 seconds. We laugh about this won't protect us when the 800-mile wind hits anyway. Then we go out and kick a ball around. I think friendship suffers, and human beings suffer when their relationships are disembodied, partly because they become so cheap and easy. I would say it might be a good thing for the 9, 10, 11-year-olds struggling with gender dysphoria not to be able to express that in their group of friends, because they may just get over it. And it's costly to express those things face to face. When you have real life friends in the real life material world, at school, it was costly to fall out. It was costly to say something nasty about somebody because you might get punched in the face. I always joke, say the students at Grove, when I was at school, we had a way of defusing social tensions. It was called fighting, and it generally worked. If you were caught by the teacher, you got smacked around the head and sent on your way. Nobody lost their job. Nobody went to counseling. Nobody got sued. The point I'm trying to make is embodied friendships. They're costly. They have a discipline to them. I don't care about what's said about me online, but every now and then my sons, who take great delight in finding comments about me, will send me a tweet or something, and I'll read it, and I don't care, and it hurts for like 10 seconds. If you live online, it's got to be agony. It has to be agony. But my friends are real people. They're the ones that I'm really concerned about what they think. The rising generation today, I think this disembodied online engagement makes it very cheap to be whoever we want, but also makes us very vulnerable to attack from other people and very vulnerable to manipulation. And so I think the anonymity, human beings are not meant to be anonymous. I'd also want to make the case that normatively, the face is very important. I'm a big believer in religious freedom, but I've always thought that the one thing that I would want banned is the Muslim face veil. Not out of any hatred of Muslims, but because if I can't see your face, I can't really interact with you. I found this with masking. I don't want to get into debates about pro and con masking, but masking was not a cost-free exercise, because if I can't see your face from there down, I can't see you. And again, I think that plays into this anonymity. We are not meant to engage in anonymous, faceless ways. We are beings with faces. I say to the students, and think how important the face is. I don't say to my students, when I left the house this morning, I kissed my wife's face. That might be technically true, but it sounds weird. That's just weird. I say I kissed my wife. And they know that I kissed her on the face when I say that. Why? Because the face is who she is. And again, that's, I say, if you're blind or But we're talking normatively here. Normative human reaction is to be physical and face to face, I think. I don't call anyone that I've only had online interaction with a friend. To reach the rank of me calling you a friend, I have to have met you bodily at some point, no matter how much we've interacted online.
One last question here.
I really liked what you said about the hospitality at the end, especially as individuals with one another. What about the church, and how can the church foster that growth?
Yeah, I think the church is the place. You know, one could have a theology of this. The church to me it's the inbreaking of the end times here and now. I'm an amillennial guy. It's a now and not yet. Paul in Colossians, you are risen in Christ. There is that. Yeah, we are the resurrected community, even though the physical resurrection has not yet happened. The church is to be a little taste of heaven on earth. And what does that mean? Apart from anything else, it means that's where you see humanity as it's meant to be. And that means that the church is to be open and hospitable. It is to be the place where you are addressed by God and by other people as a person. I love that verse, God numbers the very hairs of our heads, which means he knows less about you and me, by the way, than he did maybe 20 years ago. But, God treats us as persons. You Lutherans, Heidelberg Disputation, Thesis 28. The love of God does not find, but creates that which is pleasing to it. What does that mean? God loves us before we loved him. It's even greater than the love of a man for a woman. I fell in love with my wife because she's beautiful. But God's love is even greater than that. So I want to say the church is to reflect the character of God and the love of God and the hospitality of God. And go back to the Old Testament, Deuteronomy. I am the Lord your God who loves the widow and the sojourner and the orphan. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in Egypt. That's the basis of Old Testament ethics. And that, I think, is what the church is to manifest today. So we are to be the place where anybody can walk through the door and be treated as a person. Let's not say it's easy. I don't have any difficulty interacting with gay people. I confess, when I interact with a transgender person, it's hard. It's really hard for me. And I have to keep praying when I do that. Lord, help me to remember this is a person made in your image, because I'm obliged to do it. I'm obliged to treat every image bearer as a human person. And I think the church is the key place for that to take place, where God addresses us and where we address each other. That's where we look for. It's flawed because the end has not yet come, but that's where we should find the greatest expression of what it means to be human. And hospitality, the welcoming in of the stranger, has to be at the core of that.
Thank you, Dr. Trueman.